Welcome to the NPR Pod. We have a lot to chat about today and we're very excited. Andrew, welcome.
How's it, Brad?
You actually have a presentation that you have spoken about all around the country and you're going to talk to us about it today.
Well, I think, just to break it up, I think one of the concerns that we've got is that within South Africa, we have a huge interest in school sport, and it's massive. And I mean, everybody will be able to clarify that school sport over the last 5 or 10 years has grown. It's grown in numbers, it's grown in professionalism, it's grown in the amount of money that we're spending, both in terms of playing, in coaching, in management, in injury concerns. And I think that's generally across the board. The one thing that we do also notice, and that's where we sort of got to go back to science, and unfortunately the last study that I could find was only done in 2011, and that was by two researchers down in Cape Town, Professor Mike Lambert and Justin Durant, and they looked at rugby specifically, and they looked at the number of rugby players in South Africa at various levels, so primary school, high school, and then after school, and then professionally, and they compared that to both Australia and New Zealand. And unfortunately, the trend was in South Africa is that those numbers dropped down significantly. So by the time you look at somebody that plays sport at a school level or rugby at a school level versus what happens after that, there's a 35% drop off between the number of players that are playing school sport and the number of players that then continue to play their sport. And in other countries, that's not quite as significant. In New Zealand, club sport actually grows. And in Australia, it also grows. So there's this anomaly that sits there, which I think is something that we need to be aware of.
Why? What is going on?
Well, it's difficult to say. I think you need to look at each sport individually. I would say that there are a number of factors that stand out. Probably the one would be injuries. If you look at the number of school injuries that occur, traumatic injuries and significant injuries at school level, and that's across the board, soccer, rugby, hockey, cricket, netball, those sort of sports. You look at the number of injuries that are happening, there's a high proliferation of injuries in high school athletes. And I think those are catastrophic. So it puts people off and it makes people quite nervous. So they'll do it at school, but then afterwards they just don't seem to want to do it.
So why is that not happening in New Zealand or Australia, or not happening as much?
Well, I can't say for there. I can say maybe where it's alleviated slightly is that their preparation for these sports is a lot more controlled. So they're spending a little bit more time and effort in terms of preventing injuries on the conditioning side. And we see a lot of that changing in South Africa. But again, it's only in specific sports. Cricket is an example, and I can talk freely on cricket because I had quite a bit of experience in it. Cricket is one of those games that we think is very technical. But if you're a fast bowler and you're growing and you're developing and you're putting 6 to 7 times your body weight through your front foot, when you're landing in your bowling action, you need to be really strong. And you also need to take into consideration where you are developmentally. And I get a sense that we're not managing that. We're not noticing that. We're not reflecting on that. We're not keeping data or statistics that, okay, I'm going through a growth phase, or I've bowled X number of overs per week, per day, etc., etc. And I sometimes get a sense that we're just ignoring that. And so our funnel, because we've got a much wider berth of players, we've got a much higher number of players playing, we don't mind if we lose a couple because we've got so many players that can develop through our phases and going into the right schools and then getting into professional sport, that we don't mind if we lose a couple along the way.
That brings us to the question that brought on this topic, and that's, as a school kid, is it better to pick your sport and master it and focus on it and that becomes your whole world? Or do you play as many sports as possible to have variety in what you're doing? That's basically what your study was on.
Yeah. Look,
your presentation.
It's a hell of a difficult question to try and answer, especially in a very short space of time. I mean, there are arguments for both sides. And unfortunately, if we look at media and we look at sport out there, we look at the Tiger Woods, we look at the Williams sisters, we can pick out individuals that specialized in sports from a very early age, and they're hugely successful. Similarly, you can look at the other spectrum, the other side of the spectrum, and you can look at team sports. And a lot of those people that specialize early in the sport end up not making it because of injuries, because of a number of reasons. So it's a really difficult question to try and answer. I get a sense that we should look to have something that is more related to a long-term development of players. And one of the reasons why I say that is, in my experience, as I've tested young individuals through primary school into high school, what we can see is that there's a lack of strength, some basic core measurements, things like push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, very simple measures, but we see a drop-off in 2 to 3% per year in those measures compared to what we were 10 or 15 years ago. So when you're out at school, we may have been able to do 20 to 25 push-ups, 10, 15 pull-ups. Whereas now, if we go and test schools, and that's what we have done over the last 2 years, we go test schools in our area and we realize there's still some sports people that can't do a single push-up. And that's worrying for me. So from that perspective, there's a change in terms of what we've got to do with our young kids and with our young sports people. And you can say, well, why is that happening? Well, I think not many people are running anymore. Many people are walking to school. We don't ride bikes to school. You know, our sort of physical activities at schools are limited. You know, there's internet, there's PS4, there's Wii, there's all these sort of technologies. So we don't play a lot more. So as natural people, we tend not to climb trees anymore. We don't do a lot of that stuff.
Not as functional.
Not as functional. And that sort of starts to stack up against us. And what you do see towards the end of that is ultimately you understand that we lack this movement ability. So this ability to move our bodies. And again, you can see it in young kids. You know, you go and ask them to march and it's right foot, right hand, left hand. Whereas it should be right hand, left foot. Ask them to fall onto the ground and the first thing that they do is they put their arm out, which is why we see a proliferation of shoulder injuries, of upper body injuries, because they don't learn how to fall, they don't learn how to roll. All those things that we should be taught in physical education, which potentially may not be taught these days, we don't learn. And that I think tends to stack up and it tends to have a snowball effect. So by the time you get to 15, 16, 17 years of age and you're wanting to go into a sporting environment, if you don't have those movement abilities, that physical capability to move your body, it's very difficult. And that's what we see in those athletes that develop later, that play more sports, they have more movement ability. And there's a classic example that I give often is about A.B. de Villiers. And you see towards the back end of his career, when he was choosing how to play various shots, a lot of those were tennis strokes.
Really?
But A.B. de Villiers was a fantastic tennis player. He probably, he played very, very high level tennis. And if we look at...
I did not know that.
If we look at sportsmen of that age, we look at somebody like Mark Boucher, he was a fantastic squash player. You know, Herschel Gibbs could have chosen any one of 3 or 4 sports.
John T. Rhodes.
John T. Rhodes was a fantastic hockey player. You know, they represented their provinces or sometimes even their national sides at both sports. So the players that we refer back to, the Thabo Mngomeni, he was a fantastic soccer player in the early 90s and early 2000s. He was also a fantastic cricketer. We have these examples of multi-sport athletes that played 2 to 3 sports into high school. And then what they did is they used that capacity to move your body to direct their skill level to being very specific, into creating new movements, to creating new shots, new strokes, new ways of moving, new ways of doing things that their bodies could then accommodate for.
Now, on the other side of the spectrum, there's obviously, like you mentioned, the Williams sisters and the Tiger Woods, and I'll throw in there Michael Jordan. Obviously hugely successful. What are the odds that they were going to become that successful? Or do you find that, I know that all of them have quite a strange relationship with their parents, like it was from early on they were driven really, really hard. Some people think too hard. I mean, almost every one of them has a movie made about their relationship with how their parents were pushing them through sport. Are there tons and tons of kids who are forced or made to do one sport and focus on it that end up just hating it and quit?
Yeah, I think we've got to be very careful. I think there are lots of young sports men and women that choose one sport. As to who chooses it, that's a very difficult thing for me to answer. But we do see that more and more. There's certainly on the up the number of young people at primary school, even into high school, that are choosing one sport over the other. And I think it's partly because a lot of the sport nowadays is not only just a one-season sport. It sort of trends. It drifts into, there's a preseason phase, and then there's a season, and then there's a postseason phase. And I think you get that a lot of the sports. I mean, if I'm looking at water polo now, it's the middle of winter, but there are polo clinics, there's polo training, there's off-season polo. But how do you play polo and play hockey? It's difficult to try and do that. So at the moment, I do see that there's an increase in the numbers. As to why that's happening, I'm not sure. You know?
It's because they all watched the Tiger Woods documentary, and now they just want to be a star in one sport.
So what I can say is that, and the research will sort of back me on that, is that if you're playing an individual sport, so something like a golf or, I know basketball is more of a team sport, but you work as an individual. Even in cricket, there is a higher percentage of those athletes, those sports people that are actually choosing to go into that, because it's just those sports tend to do that. The other thing is, you look at something like gymnastics. You can't wait until you're through your development stage, because in gymnastics, if you're not peaking sort of 13, 14, 15, you've missed your opportunity. So there are certain sports that lend itself towards early specialization, and there are others that tend not to. And the team sports are generally those ones that tend not to, because there's a skill set, there's a development, there's being able to identify space. There are all sorts of other competencies that you need to develop that I think just take a bit of time. It's not just how you perform as an individual on the field. It relates to your teammates, the structure that you play, the technical ability, and how you can look and read and see the game.
So for the parents watching, what are the potential consequences for a young kid to start specializing in a sport early? In terms of physiologically, like you were mentioning, a bowler putting 7 times his body weight in the front foot constantly, if that's all you're doing.
So I think that the key to note is that our bodies are generally resilient. But if you're focusing on too much, too often, in much higher intensities, it's just injury and burnout. I mean, those are the two things that we see. The long-term effect of that, and we haven't quite tied that up. We don't know if that's a causing factor, but we do, again, as I said earlier, in a rugby scenario, we know that a lot of rugby players stop playing. Anecdotally, I can tell you that a lot of water polo players stop playing polo once they leave school. And people could argue that there are a number of reasons for that. There are, but I think a lot of that is because a lot of water polo players are pushed to do too much, too quickly, too early, and they just, both physically and emotionally and mentally, they've had enough. They get supposedly hurtful and just say, right, okay, I'm done. I've had enough.
The rest of please take me, I feel like I took you on a side quest there.
Look, I mean, I think these are all valid points. I think the one big thing we've got to watch out for at any stage, and that doesn't mean, if you're specializing early, you're specializing late. It's just is the amount of training that you're doing, and how, is there a tipping point? Is there a point at which if you train more, whether or not you're going to improve more? And the science will tell us that up until about 13, 14 years of age, about 8-9 hours a week is probably where we are. If you go to 10 hours, so one of the studies that we looked at, and these are all studies from about 2011, 2012, what you can see is it's pretty even until you get to 12, 13 years of age. And then after that, those people that excel but do a variety of training benefit better than those people that only choose a sport and suddenly increase it. So in other words, it's not just the number of hours that you train that's effective, it's the type of training. So if you're a swimmer and you get to 15, 16 and you're about to sort of get into that elitish type of level, if you just continue to swim, your risk of injury and burnout is hugely high. If we look at those people that have similar training variables or similar training load up until that point, and then when they increase it with different things. So they might increase it with running, they might increase it with strength or training, they might increase it with some flexibility work. So they're still getting the same amount of time or the volume of training in, but the volume is different. We realize that they don't suffer from burnout and their performances ultimately increase. And when we look at it at the back end, those are the successful athletes. Those are what we would then term elite athletes or near elite athletes. And that's the differential that we see.
And are those the A.B. de Villiers, the John T. Rose, the Mark Bouchers, the Skalkbergers? We chatted, you said Skalkberger was also a cricketer.
Yeah, fantastic cricketer at school. Yeah.
So does it lie with coaches at school? Because, I mean, even when I was at school, it was always a struggle of where am I going to put I remember my rugby coach was always angry with my athletics coach, which was angry with my cricket coach. Does the problem lie with the kids? Or do schools and the idea of sports, do we need to be able to lend your player and go, you are the rugby captain, but you're also opening batsman, go for it?
Yeah, look, rather than trying to lay blame, I think we just need to find a solution to it. And I am aware that there are a lot of schools that are looking into this quite seriously because they realize that, a player that gets injured, or the player that's unhappy or is overtrained gets injured and is likely not to want to play sport. And so the schools are taking notice of this, and there are a number of schools that I'm aware of that have sort of got these dual athletes, these dual player processes. But I think we need to engage more in that, because I would strongly recommend that if you play a summer sport and a winter sport and you're good at both and you can play at a high level at both, I think we should be encouraged to do that as much as possible. There will always be physical abilities that one can tie over from one sport to the next. Even in something like a swimming or an aquatic type of sport into something like a hockey or a netball or a rugby, there's a certain amount of strength that we should be doing across the board that will help us. And then obviously you can do your sport-specific training over and above that. But I still believe that the best way, the most consistent way of firstly allowing our young athletes and players to have fun and enjoy it, to stop this attrition rate. Because remember, if you play sport at school and you get into varsity or get after school and you suddenly stop, we're then going to be dealing with a whole sector of the population that doesn't do physical activity, doesn't do physical exercise. And in 5 or 10 years from now, people like Discovery or Sanlam or Bonitas will start to have much more major medical issues. And I think those are some of the things that we need to be aware of at a schoolboy level. We need to be very aware that if we have these big drop-offs at school, it has much bigger consequences than just, okay, there's not enough people playing sport anymore. It'll affect the health of the population.
So we were speaking about, you mentioned burnout earlier, and that's obviously a big thing with school kids. People who are doing many sports, people who are specializing in a sport, one particular sport. How do we wrap our head around training? How long or how often should kids be training?
Yeah, I think this is a topic that was brought out many years ago. Malcolm Gladwell released a book, Outliers, which basically was about 10,000 hours. And his concept was if any athlete spent 10,000 hours, they would be absolutely proficient at a particular sport. And he didn't only use it in sport, he used it across the board. He used it in chess. So he just thought that practicing was more important. It was around 10,000 hours. About a year or two later, another author, John Brenkus, I think his name was, he brought out something called appropriate practice. So now it wasn't just enough to practice 10,000 hours, you had to do appropriate practice. So what he was trying to do is he was trying to link in aspects of development, aspects of growth, aspects of maturity. So trying to look a little bit more specifically at looking at some of those natural processes that young boys and girls go through and try and link it to that. So what we do see that it's not only about the number of hours that we practice, it's about the type of practice that you do. And that's what I said earlier, when we look at those elite and those near elite athletes, it's the type of practice. When you're getting into high school, when you're 16, 17, 18 and you're a swimmer, are you just swimming? Are you just putting time in the pool, throwing a ball, spending time on the practice field? Or are you spending time improving your physical capacity and improving your technical capacity? So you're doing off-field sessions, you might be doing gym work, you might be doing motivational work, you might be doing some headspace work, you might be doing some tactical work. It doesn't always have to be physical in nature, but are you spending that time growing your ability to understand the sport? And so we realize that appropriate practice actually becomes a lot more important than just practicing for 10,000 hours.
To sum up, I'm taking away from this that one day when I have kids, I will encourage them to do multiple sports for their health and their bodies and their mental strength. Is that a safe assumption to take out of this conversation? So I'm hanging my keys on doing more sports is better as a child than specializing at one sport.
So my opinion would be yes. You're spot on. I can reference a study that was done in South Africa by Bridge and Toms in 2011, and they basically said that if you played 3 sports up until pre-adolescence, so pre-adolescence is sort of 12, 13, 11, 12, 13, around there, you had a much greater opportunity or chance of playing national sport.
That's a study.
That was a study.
Did you hear that? If you play 3 sports, you have a greater chance at making a national team.
In pre-adolescence. So basically in primary school. And that builds the foundation. That's sort of the building block. Those are the movement capacities, the ability to move, to use your body, to understand what it feels like, to be able to roll, to fall, to tumble, those sort of things. So it's about physical ability, it's your physical capacity. And again, it's what all children should be taught as part of the physical education process in primary schools. That's why it's fundamental that our children continue with physical education at schools.
So the perfect timeline for an athlete, according to the studies, would be in primary school, you get a couple of sports, 2 to 3 to 4 sports, you learn how to do everything, and then through high school, you start specializing and you move into, you play provincial in 2 or 3 sports, 2 sports, and then you slip into your specialization and then you're off to the races.
In my opinion, it would be the safest one. I also think we'd have a lot of people that would be a lot happier. You would have, I would suggest, and I don't know because the data can't prove that for me, but I would suggest that our attrition rate after school would drop off. I think our injury lists, our injury rates would also decrease just because the level at which people were trying to perform would be a little bit more manageable. But again, it does come with its risks. You then got to manage load. You've got to sort of manage, well, I've got 2 sports. So one sport, molds and meshes into the other one. One's I'm still in the season, but I'm pre-season for the other one. But again, that comes back to communication. It just comes back to the athlete, the person. They must be at the forefront of any decision that we make. So if you're missing a practice session because you're doing a strength session, that's okay. But it needs to be negotiated and it needs to be discussed between the parent, the coach, the athlete, and the school as to how that goes about.
Very interesting. Andrew, thank you so much. I hope that parents will watch this and listen to it because our future of sport is very important and it starts young.
Well, remember, Brad, the reason why we're speaking about this is because people have started to ask us these questions. So I'm going to encourage the audience to ask us questions again. If there's something that we haven't answered that you want to know answers to, I'll just try and give you the science. I'll try and find out if there's science behind it. But what we talked about today is my experience in terms of testing young people, being involved in that for the last 20, 30 years. And then looking at the data that I just have access to try and give people, to try and interpret it and to make it functional so people can actually use data and we can make informed decisions.
The last 5 minutes of every week's episode, we are going to dedicate to answering your questions. I'm not going to answer them. Andrew's going to answer them, which is a much better idea. If you liked what you heard today, please click like and subscribe the NPR Pod. We love talking to Andrew. Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad.
I will see you next week where I confirm that Glasgow smashed Leinster out and we have a South African final of the URC. Quick predictions. Warriors, Bulls over Sharks.
Bulls,
and
I don't mind who wins the other one.
No, you do, because where are we playing?
I think Leinster will win.
Leinster's going to win, and then we're going to go through to the
Bulls
finals.
are going to do the hard yards. They're going to make a hard route. But I'm South African.
Let's go. Catch you next week.